In just over a month, James Gunn will officially kick off the DC's new cinematic continuity on the big screen with the release of Superman, the most anticipated superhero film since Avengers Endgame, and also, somehow already, the most divisive since Batman v Superman. Many are incredibly excited to see what this new era of comic book adaptations has in store for the characters of the DC Universe, while many others are still angry about all the wasted potential of Zack Snyder's previous attempt to build DC its own cinematic universe. I, for one, will always be incredibly frustrated at how things turned out with Snyder's universe, but I am not rooting for James Gunn to fail, mainly because there is no chance of the Snyderverse being restored, so I might as well enjoy what we're getting. Largely because I think this new take on the DC Universe has a ton of potential of its own, and partly because, as much as I love how the Snyderverse started and much of its approach towards the source material, I was already increasingly frustrated with it before it all came crashing down. And from what we know of Snyder's plans, I'm not sure I would have been happy with the end result had he stayed in charge. So my feelings regarding the past and future of DC are complicated at the moment. If you know me, or have learned anything about me from watching my videos, you should know two things. First, that nothing frustrates me more than untapped and wasted potential, and second, that I can't move on from such frustration until I feel I have realized that potential, at least in my own mind. So that is what I'm here to do. At the risk of pissing off all DC fans on both sides of the Gunn-Snyder divide, but with the hope of pleasing most of them, I am not doing this as one trying to tear apart the Snyderverse, or as one trying to fight the dawn of the DCU. I mourn the past, and welcome the future. In this new series of videos, I am merely seeking my own form of closure, saying goodbye to what was, by imagining what could have been, before letting it go and embracing what's coming. So with that long-winded preface out of the way, let me explain exactly what I'm doing. This video is the beginning of a series, in which I will outline my own DC cinematic universe, building on the foundation of the Snyderverse. I will first rewrite some of the existing films of the DCEU, then begin to lay out my own storyline, continuing the saga to its own climactic endgame. Along the way, I will be doing a lot of deep and intricate world building to tie all the disparate lore and mythologies of the DC universe into a cohesive whole. I don't know how many videos will be in this series or how long I'll be making them, but this video will attempt to briefly offer an overarching vision for this epic storyline. So if you like what I share, please subscribe so you don't miss my future videos in this series, in which I will be diving into the details of each phase of my plan, some of my favorite individual projects within it, and all the awesome mythology I've created for this universe. With all that said, I'm just thinking out loud here, so without further ado, let's dive into my vision for what could have been the DCEU. Before I begin my outline, let me make sure we understand what it is I loved so much about the Snyderverse, and will be trying to not only retain, but often further emphasize in my version amidst all my changes. I know that I'm by no means the first person to take on the task of fixing the DCEU, but most people I've seen rewrite the films and restructure the whole timeline do so without any intent to stick to the thematic and tonal core of the first couple films, which is what I intend to do. The Snyderverse started out with the basic premise that these heroes are appearing in our world, the real world, for the first time. This is not a comic book universe in which the laws of physics don't apply. Aliens and monsters wreaking havoc on major metropolitan areas is a common occurrence, and costume metahumans are relied upon to protect us from such threats. This is plain old, ordinary reality, with all the messiness and moral complexity comics typically help us escape. And it's to this world where Man of Steel begins this story by dropping the news that not only are we not alone in the universe, not only might alien life of godlike power be ready to wipe us out in a second, but this alien life is walking among us, and we are totally dependent upon it for our continued existence on this planet. The following films then attempt to ask how this world would react to that news, and what it would be like for these gods among men to try to be its heroes. As I will get into throughout this series, I think there were numerous issues with the film's attempts to explore this question, but I love this premise, and will be keeping it as the foundation of my DCEU. Keeping it in mind as the driving theme of my story, even when I feel Zack Snyder abandoned it for spectacle. With that established, let me again clarify. For those most excited for the new DCEU thanks to its lighter tone and unabashed embrace of the fantastical nature of the comics, that I get the fatigue over grounded superhero stories. We've never had a series of live-action superhero films that embrace everything fans love about the comics to the degree that James Gunn is doing, and I'm as excited for it as anyone. I don't think there is one right way to adapt popular comic book characters that have already been through so many variations in their decades of history. And that's what makes them so great. Every unique iteration only adds to their mythology, and I'm not suggesting this storyline because I think it should be the definitive adaptation. I just think it would have made the most of everything I loved about Zack Snyder's films, and simply made for a great story. So now that I hope we're on the same page about what I'm trying to accomplish here, let's finally get started with this outline, shall we? If I break this timeline up into phases, then Phase 1 will essentially be the existing Snyder trilogy, so here I'll be doing mostly rewriting. Obviously, everything starts with Man of Steel, which is by far the project in the DCEU I have the fewest issues with. I already made a video a few years back sharing some of the slight tweaks I would make to the film, primarily in an effort to highlight Superman's moral character and his internal struggle and growth. There are some more substantial changes I might make that I didn't cover in that video, but they are in regards to the world building of Krypton, not fixing issues with the basic plot or Superman's character, so if I cover them, it will be in a video devoted to my world building for this universe. Moving on, the next installment of the DCEU is, of course, Batman v Superman. But real quick, before I get into that, many complain that Ben Affleck's Batman wasn't introduced in his own film before his debut. Personally, I don't feel this is an issue that necessarily needs to be fixed, but I am planning on making Robin's death a much stronger emphasis than it was in BVS. So if there is a Batman film in this timeline before he meets Superman, it will definitely be set before Man of Steel and essentially be a combination of the Killing Joke and death in the family, with the Joker doing you-know-what to the Gordon family, and Batman beating him nearly to death before Jim, of all people, restrains him, only for the Joker to escape and commit one final atrocity against Jason Todd before vanishing, leaving Batman to vow that he will hunt down and kill the Joker once and for all. Now, with that plot laid out, I want to reiterate that I don't think this movie needs to be made. In fact, I think this whole epic saga is the story of the world grappling with the existence of gods among men, a story that starts with Man of Steel. And as such, it seems weird to start this saga with a film set before the events of that movie. As such, I am fine with the events I described being revealed as backstory in BVS. Speaking of which, let's jump into the movie that started this whole project of mine. I've been trying to rewrite Batman v Superman for years now, and what makes it so frustrating is that it tries to do so much in such a short amount of time. It tries to be a slow, thoughtful, and deliberately paced thriller with complex political intrigue and psychological manipulation. It tries to set up an epic and compelling clash between these two titans. It tries to set the stage for the Justice League, and it decides to end with the iconic death of Superman. Even the Ultimate Edition isn't nearly long enough to juggle all these disparate stories smashed into one film and pay off on all of the setup. Could they have done better than they did with the time they had? Sure, and I've written a number of alternate endings and significant plot tweaks over the years that would definitely improve it, but none of them satisfied me because it still felt like each element of the story could be so much better if it wasn't forced to share a 3-hour runtime with every other element of this movie. So without scrapping massive chunks of the plot entirely and practically starting from scratch, I saw only one solution: convert Batman v Superman into a season of television. Thus, my plan for my DC universe began to form. If BVS was going to be a season of television, why stop there? I decided that the central storyline, rather than a series of Justice League films, would be a television series that could take its time to focus on a wide cast of characters and properly flesh out all the complex intrigue between them, letting plots simmer, build, and intertwine more than you see in individual films. Prominent individual characters would still get standalone films, and a few groups of characters relatively removed from the main storyline might get at least a season of their own series. But back to the main series, it would be titled Gods Among Men, and each season would probably have about 10 or so hour-long episodes. Season 1 would adapt Batman v Superman, retaining many of the same essential plot beats of the film, but fleshing out some things more, such as taking Lex's political machinations and the intrigue and controversy surrounding Superman in the film way further, even leading to major geopolitical conflict and pushing Superman to the brink of going full injustice mode. We'd also take a lot more time to properly build up Batman and Superman's beef so that their clash feels earned and personal. And we'd use far more subtlety to introduce the wider cast of the DC Universe and set up the formation of the Justice League. And of course, I'll be focusing heavily on trying to do the main characters justice where the film failed, showing a more hopeful and personable Superman while explicitly addressing Batman's no-kill rule. Of course, if Season 1 adapts BVS, Season 2 would adapt Justice League. And yes, even though the Snyder Cut is already 4 hours long, I have plenty in mind to add to it. Mainly, I'll be building a lot more mystery around the mother boxes before we learn what's going on with them, and I'll show what the government is up to during all this, probably getting in the leak's way a lot. But anyway, that would be the end of Phase 1, which would also include Wonder Woman and Suicide Squad. The former could use some editing, including a very different third act, but it would overall be a very similar film. Suicide Squad, on the other hand, let's just say for now that it would be a very different film. In fact, I think I'd turn this one into a season of television as well, and it will do a lot to bridge the gap between Seasons 1 and 2 of Gods Among Men, with Batman himself likely serving as the main antagonist as he and the government race to track down metahumans. Heck, maybe it will set up a confrontation between the League and Task Force X at some point in Season 2 of the main show. We'll just have to see. But I can and will dive much deeper into all these rewrites in a future video. For now, let's move on to what the future could have held in store for the Snyderverse. If I was in charge of it, that is. Phase 2 would include at least 2 more seasons of Gods Among Men, adapt a handful of existing DCEU films to better fit the tone of this universe, and feature a couple original films and series as well. Let's start with the main story, shall we? Season 3 of Gods Among Men has been my favorite to think about. I have a lot of ideas for it, and I'm going to do my best to save most of them for the video devoted to Phase 2. But in short, this season's plot takes inspiration from George Miller's cancelled film Justice League Mortal. If you're not familiar with it, its main villain would have been Maxwell Lord, who uses Batman's Brother Eye surveillance satellite and the experimental cybernetics project OMAC in an attempt to destroy Earth's heroes, turning them against each other in the process. My story won't be a copy and paste of Miller's by any means. It has plenty of substantial differences, such as Maxwell Lord not actually wanting to destroy the League. That's Lex Luthor's plan. But let's start from the beginning. In the wake of Season 2, the world is terrified as it tries to figure out what just happened with the whole attempted invasion of Apokolips. No one's sure if the planet is safe or how to react to the appearance of this small army of godlike beings, including a miraculously resurrected Superman. In this context, Maxwell Lord, who I envision as a veteran spy and the director of the UN's secretive intelligence agency Checkmate, seeks to recruit the members of the League and organize them into an official UN-sanctioned defense force the public can trust. In doing so, he becomes much like Cecil from Invincible in his role, offering our heroes invaluable support and legitimacy, while also bossing them around and keeping his shady agendas to himself. To briefly sum up what happens next, Batman is extremely suspicious of Lord and refuses to take orders from the government, fracturing the League in the process, while Lex Luthor campaigns hard against Lord, sabotaging him to set up his League as global dictators, while creating his own means of combating them for the US government. After lots of messy political and interpersonal conflict that sees the League hunting down Batman, who creates his own team, and fighting a rogue Brother Eye and OMAC program, Lord is finally killed at the hands of Wonder Woman. Luthor is more powerful than ever, having become President of the United States, and the Trinity have all left the League, which is now run by Amanda Waller in Lord's place. Frankly, I've got so many ideas for this season that I think it could easily be split into 2, but for now, we'll just call this whole storyline Season 3. As for what I had in mind for Season 4, well, I'm still going a bit back and forth on that. I imagined in the latter part of Phase 2 we'd see Black Adam and Shazam come into the picture, changing the hierarchy of power in the DC universe, as The Rock would put it. I imagine this conflict impacting the direction of the show and involving all its characters too much to not make it a part of the main series, even the focus of the fourth season. But I would also want to focus on both new characters enough to justify their own films. I'm thinking that they could be introduced in their own films, but have their ultimate clash in the show. But I don't know that I want to keep Dr. Savannah or Sabak, so I'm not sure how to do that. Regardless, I'll work out the details. But for now, just know that in Phase 2, we'd get pretty heavily altered versions of the Shazam and Black Adam films in one form or another, fitting the much more grounded tone of this universe, before the characters' ultimate clash, which wouldn't be an isolated incident, but a major part of the larger story, involving many major characters of the DC universe. Speaking of DCEU films, let's go over which ones I'd keep. I'd definitely keep Aquaman, which would probably take place immediately after Season 2 of Gods Among Men, and cause Aquaman to not be a part of Maxwell Lord's League as he devotes himself to ruling Atlantis. I am struggling to figure out how to make the Atlantean lore make sense in this universe, and it will probably look very different, but the plot of the film will remain quite similar. I also think a version of Birds of Prey could be great, one that is not just a Harley Quinn movie, and depicts its characters much more faithfully. In fact, it would probably center on Barbara Gordon as Oracle, as she puts together the team and learns to be a hero in her handicapped condition, and she would ultimately pass on the mantle of Batgirl to Cassandra Cain, who is being hunted by her family and the League of Assassins, as well as Black Mask. Harley Quinn could still be in it, just in a much smaller role. Frankly, this might make for a better season of television as well, now that I think about it. I also think this should take place before most of the events of Season 3 of Gods Among Men, since I imagine Batman recruits the Birds of Prey to his team when he leaves the League, but of course I'll get into that in another video. Moving on to some unmade DCEU projects that I'd love to see in Phase 2, Ben Affleck's Batman film would be a must. His script sounds great from what I know of it, though I might increase the influence from Under the Red Hood and have Batman forced to finally confront the Joker and choose once and for all whether or not to break his one rule and fulfill his vow to avenge Jason. I'd also love a Man of Steel sequel, definitely titled Man of Tomorrow, and I imagine the villain being Brainiac, though at this point I don't have any more in mind for it than that, and I'm not sure how it would fit into the larger picture of the story. The other biggest thing I have in mind is a Lanterns show. In the one time I might go more fantastical than James Gunn, I would have this series set almost entirely in space, and be largely unaffected by the events of the main story on Earth. I do like the dynamic the DCU's Lanterns show is using with a seasoned Hal Jordan training a rookie John Stewart, and I might steal that, but their investigations will take them to much more exotic locations than a rural US farm town, and focus on much more Lantern lore than the show we're getting. Their investigation may be triggered by Apocalypse's failed invasion in Season 2 of Gods Among Men, and we'll see the Lanterns learn about the new gods and all the crazy mythology surrounding them as they try to figure out what threat awaits their universe. This show would do a lot to set up the climactic events of Phase 3, particularly by introducing the prophecy of Blackest Night, on which I have my own very unique take. See, rather than Blackest Night being a zombie apocalypse, with Necron creating an army of undead superheroes, here, the prophecy refers to the power of anti-life. Here, the power of Necron is the power that Darkseid seeks, to enslave all life by extinguishing the very force of life harnessed by the Lanterns. Now that sets us up perfectly to dive into Phase 3, but first let me just say that I have a bunch of other ideas for projects that could take place in this universe, whether from the DCEU or my own imagination, but none that I have enough thoughts on to share yet. Perhaps the second Wonder Woman and Aquaman films could exist, though they'd probably be almost unrecognizable. I like the idea of a Justice League Dark storyline, which would be a quite grounded supernatural horror story reminiscent of the Conjuring universe. And since Ryan Choi was introduced in Snyder's Justice League, we could give him his own Atom film. If I come up with much more to say about any of these or other ideas, I'll include them in later videos. Now we arrive at the final phase of my DC universe. Here I definitely have the least set in stone, so I will save most of my thoughts for later videos. However, it would start with either a film or perhaps a season of television for The Flash, in which he has finally developed the technology to time travel and uses it to save his mother. So, the same basic setup from the existing film, but that's about where the similarities end. Here, he would discover the multiverse, which is the result of time travelers creating alternate branching timelines whenever they go back in time. I imagine he meets other speedsters, including Eobard Thawne, aka Reverse Flash, and Jay Garrick, who may have somehow given Barry his powers in the first place by time traveling into him. In fact, that event may have been what initially awoke the Mother Boxes, not Superman's death. Anyway, in this story, Barry learns that Darkseid has been consuming one timeline after another, and speedsters have been trying to create new universes and prepare them for the inevitable, faster than he can find and conquer them. Perhaps Barry even learns of the Monitors, the only beings more powerful than the new gods, as well as Mobius the Anti-Monitor, perhaps the only being who can stop Darkseid. The story ends with Barry returning to his universe, either inadvertently leading Darkseid right to it, or learning it's already doomed and bringing the Anti-Monitor with him in a desperate play to destroy Darkseid in his universe once and for all. Meanwhile, the final season of Lanterns would end with Apocalypse coming to this universe and going to war against Oa and destroying the Guardians, leaving the Lantern Corps virtually helpless to stop the Blackest Night as Darkseid sets his sights on Earth. And finally, in Season 5 of Gods Among Men, we'd essentially see a loose adaptation of Final Crisis, with Darkseid unlocking Anti-Life to enslave all life in the universe in spite of the League's best efforts. However, thanks to the few remaining lanterns across the spectrum uniting their power, they are able to create the pure White Lantern light, the life to oppose Darkseid's anti-life, and grant some the power to resist his will. I don't know where the break between seasons 5 and 6 will be or in exactly what order all my ideas will play out, but the final season will include elements of not only Final Crisis and Blackest Night, but also Crisis on Infinite Earths and the Darkseid War. The Flash, returning from his solo adventure, unleashes the Anti-Monitor on Darkseid, and possibly also brings an army of characters from other timelines to join the fight. Batman sacrifices himself to kill Darkseid, while Superman plays a key role in breaking his hold on all life. And finally, with Darkseid gone and the Anti-Monitor the only remaining threat, the Flash sacrifices himself to stop the Anti-Monitor from destroying all reality, though perhaps not before granting his powers to his nephew Wally West. So that's it. That is a maybe not so brief outline of the entire timeline of my DC Cinematic Universe. However, this is only the beginning, as I will now begin working on videos detailing each season of Gods Among Men, along with some of the other major projects of this universe, and the lore that ties it all together. Hopefully my next completed project will be my full rewrite of Batman v Superman, aka Gods Among Men Season 1. Let me know what you're most excited for me to get into, what you would most have loved to see in reality, and perhaps any questions, thoughts, or feedback of your own that I might take into consideration as I make my future videos. I hope you enjoy this project nearly as much as I will, and I can't wait to join you in the comment section. Until next time, never stay silent.